Chapter 5. Just Nobody. After the midday meal, while walking about the place, Mr. Howitt found a well-worn path. It led him to the group of the pines not far from the house, where 5 rough headstones marked the 5 mounds placed side by side. A little apart from those, there was another mound, alone. Beneath the pines, the needles made a carpet, firm and smooth, figured by the wild wood-bin that clambered over the graves. Moss had gathered on the headstones, and the wind, in the dark branches above, moaned ceaselessly. About the little plot of ground a rustic fence of poles was built, and the path led to a stile which one might enter the enclosure. The stranger seated himself upon the rude steps. Below and far away he saw the low hills, rolling ridge on ridge like the waves of a great sea, until in the blue distance they were so lost in the sky that he could not say which was mountain and which was cloud. His poet heart was stirred at the sight of the vast reaches of the forest, all shifting light and shadows, the cool depths of nearby woods with the sunlight filtering through the leafy arches in streaks and patches of gold on green, and the wide, wide sky with fleets of cloud ships sailing to unseen ports below the hills. The man sat very still, and as he looked the worn face changed, and once, as if some pleasing memory, he smiled. A gray squirrel with bright eyes full of curiosity regard peeped over the limb of an oak. A redbird hopped from bush to bush whistling to his mate, and a bob's white quick call came from a nearby thicket. The dreamer was aroused at last by the musical tinkle of a bell. He turned his face towards the sound, but could see nothing. The bell was coming nearer. It came nearer still. And there he sat and saw then through the trees small moving patches of white. An old ewe, followed by 2 lambs, came from behind a clump of bushes, and the moving patches of white shaped themselves into other sheep feeding into the timber. Mr. Howitt sat quite still, and while the old ewe paused to look at him, the lambs took advantage of the opportunity until their mother was satisfied with her inspection and, by moving on, upset them. Soon the whole flock surrounded him, and, after the first lingering look of inquiry, paid no heed to his presence. Then, from somewhere among the trees came the quick, low bark of a dog. The man looked carefully in every direction. He could see nothing but the sheep, yet he felt himself observed. Again came the short bark, and this time a voice. A girl's voice, Mr. Howitt thought, said, "It's all right, Brave. Go on, brother." And from behind a big rock not far away a shepherd dog appeared, followed by a youth of some 15 years. He was a lightly built boy, a bit tall for his age perhaps, but perfectly erect, and his every movement was one of indescribable grace, while he managed somehow to wear his rough backwoods garments with the air of distinction as remarkable as it was charming. The face was finely molded, almost girlish, and with the large gray eyes in its frame of yellow golden hair. It was a sad face when in repose, yet wonderfully responsive to every passing thought and mood. But the eyes, with their strange expression and shifting light, proclaimed the lad's mental condition. As the boy came forward in a shy, hesitating way, an expression of amazement and wonder crept into the stranger's face. He left his seat and started forward. "Howard," he said. "Howard." "That's not his name, mister. His name's Pete," returned the youth in low, soft tones. In the voice and manner of the lad, no less than his face and eyes, Mr. Howard read his story. Unconsciously he echoed the words of Mr. Matthews. Poor Pete. The dog lifted his head and looked into the man's face, while his tail wagged a joyous greeting, and as the man stopped to pat the animal and speak a few kind words, a beautiful smile broke over the delicate features of the youth. Throwing himself upon the ground, he cried, "Come here, Brave," and taking the dog's face between his hands, said in confidential tones, ignoring Mr. Howitt's presence, "He's a good man, ain't he, brother?" The dog answered with a wagging tail, "We sure like him, don't we?" The dog gave a low bark. "Listen, Brave, listen." He lifted his face to the tree tops and then turned his ear to the ground, while the dog, too, seemed to hearken. Again that strange smile illuminated his face. "Yes, Brave, we sure do like 'em, and the tree things like 'em, too, and the flowers, and the little flower things that know everything, they're all singing to Pete 'cause he's come. Did you see the flower things in his eyes and hear the trees a talking to his voice, Brave? And see, brother, the sheep like 'em, too." Pointing towards the stranger, he laughed aloud. The old ewe had come quite close to the man, and one of the lambs was nibbling on his trouser leg. Mr. Howitt seated himself on the stile again, and the dog, released by the youth, came to lie down at his feet, while the boy seemed to forget his companions and appeared to be listening to voices unheard by them, now and then nodding his head, moving his lips to answer. The old man looked long and thoughtfully at the youth, his own face revealing a troubled mind. This then was Pete. Poor Pete. "Howard," whispered the man, "the perfect image." And then again he said half aloud, "Howard." The boy turned his face and smiled. "That ain't his name, mister. His name's Pete. Pete seen you yesterday over on Dewey, and Pete, he heard the big hills and the woods a-singing when you talked. But Jed, he didn't hear. Jed, he don't hear nothing but himself. He can't. But Pete, he heard, and all Pete's people, too. And the gray mist things, they come out and danced along the mountains 'cause they're so glad that you come. And Pete went along with you along the old trail. Course, though, you didn't know. Do you like Pete's people, mister?" He waved his hands to include the forest, the mountains, and the sky, and there was a note of anxiety in the sweet voice as he asked again, "Do you like Pete's friends?" "Yes, indeed, I like your friends," replied Mr. Howitt heartily, "and I'd like to be your friend, too, if you'll let me. What's your other name?" The boy shook his head. Not me. Do you like Pete?" The man was puzzled. "Are you not Pete?" he asked. The delicate face grew sad. No, I'm not Pete. Pete, he lives in here." He touched himself on the breast. I'm... A look of hopeless bewilderment crept into his eyes. "I don't know who I am. I'm just nobody. Nobody can have no name, can he?" He stood with a downcast head, and then suddenly he raised his face, and the shadows lifted as he said, "But Pete, he knows, mister. Ask Pete." A sudden thought came to Mr. Howard. "Who's your father, my boy?" Instantly the brightness vanished, and again the words were a puzzled moan. "I ain't got no father, mister. I ain't me. Nobody can have no father, can he?" The other spoke quickly. But Pete has a father. Who is Pete's father?" Instantly the gloom was gone and the face was bright again. "Sure, mister, Pete's got a father, don't you know? Everybody knows. Look." He pointed upward to a break in the trees, to a large, cumulus cloud that had assumed a fantastic shape. "He lives in them white hills up there. You see him, mister? Sometimes he takes Pete with him up through the sky, and of course I go along. We sail and we sail and we sail with the big bird things up there while the sky things sing, and sometimes we play with the cloud things all day in them white hills. Pete says he'll take me away up there where the star things live. Some day we won't never come back again, and I won't be nobody no more, and Aunt Molly says she reckoned Pete's knows. Of course, I'd hate mightily much to go away from Uncle Matt and Aunt Molly and Matt and Sammy, 'cause they're pretty good to me. But I just gotta go where Pete goes, you see, 'cause I ain't nobody, and nobody can't be nothing, can he?" The stranger was fascinated by the wonderful charm of the boy's manner and words, as the lad's sensitive face glowed or was clouded by each wayward thought, and the music of his sweet voice rose and fell. Mr. Howitt told himself that one might easily fancy the child some wandering spirit of the woods and hills. Aloud he asked, "Has Pete a mother too?" The youth nodded towards the big pine that grew to one side of the group, and lowered his voice and replied, "That's Pete's mother." Mr. Howard pointed to the grave. "You mean she sleeps there?" "No, no, not there. There." He pointed to the big tree itself. "She never sleeps, don't you hear?" He paused. The wind moaned through the branches of the pines, and drawing closer to the stranger's side, the boy whispered, "She always talks that way, always, and it makes Pete feel bad. She wants somebody. You hear her calling and calling and calling. He'll sure come someday, mister, he sure will. Say, do you know where he is?" The stranger, startled, drew back. "No, no, my boy, certainly not. What do you mean? Who are you?" Like the moaning of the pines came the reply, "Nothing, mister. Nobody can't mean nothing, can they? I'm just nobody. But Pete lives in here. Ask Pete." "Is Pete watching the sheep?" asked Mr. Howard, anxious to divert the boy's mind to other channels. "Yeah, we're tending them now. But they can't trust us, you know. When they call Pete, he just goes, and of course I gotta go along." "And who is it that calls Pete?" "Why, don't you know? I allowed you knowed about them things. They called Pete last night. The moonlight things were out, and all the shadowy things. Didn't you see them, mister? The moonlit things, the wind, the stars, the shadow things, and all the rest played with Pete in the misty shadows, and of course I was along. Didn't you hear singing? Pete, he's always singing that way when the moonlight things go out. Seems he just can't help it." "Well, what becomes of the sheep when Pete's away?" The boy shook his head sadly. "Sometimes they get so lost that young Matt can't never find them, and sometimes wolves get 'em. It's too bad, mister, it sure is." Then, laughing aloud, he clapped his hands. "There was a feller at the ranch to keep 'em, but he didn't stay. No, no, he didn't stay, you bet he didn't. Pete didn't like 'em. Brave didn't like 'em. Nothing didn't like 'em. The trees wouldn't talk when he was around. The flowers died when he looked at 'em, and all the birds stopped singing and went away over the mountains. He didn't stay, though." Again he laughed. "You bet he didn't stay. Pete knows." "Well, why'd the man go?" asked Mr. Howard, thinking to solve a part of a mystery at least. But the only answer he could draw from the boy was, "Pete knows. Pete knows." Later, when the stranger returned to the house, Pete went with him. At the big gate they met Mr. Matthews, returning unsuccessfully from his trip. "Hello, boy," said the big man. "How's Pete today?" The lad went with a glad face to meet the giant mountaineer. It was clear that the two were of the warmest friends. "Pete's mighty glad today, 'cause he's come." He pointed to Mr. Howitt. "Oh, does Pete like him?" The boy nodded. "All Pete's people like him. Ask him to keep the sheep, Uncle Matt. He won't be scared at the shadow things at night." Mr. Matthews smiled as he turned to his guest. "Well, Pete never makes a mistake in his judgment of men, Mr. Howard. He is different from us ordinary folks, as you can see, but in some things he knows a heap more. I'm mighty glad he's took up with you, sir. All day I've been thinking I'd tell you about some things I don't like to talk about. I feel after last night that you'd understand maybe and might help me. You have education, but still I've been a little afraid, us being such strangers. I know I'm right now, 'cause Pete says so. If you weren't the kind of man I think you are, he'd never took up to you like he has." That night, the mountaineer told the stranger from the city the story that I have put down in the next chapter. End of chapter 5.